plan person. Welcome back.
Cyberspace.
Empirical training. Do you know what I mean? So they're like empirical training.
Hello, welcome back to the Cyberspace Podcast, a space for cybersecurity professionals, aspiring professionals, and even those just interested in being a little bit more secure in their daily lives and understand the threat landscape and how it impacts them. My name's Josh. I'm the host of Cyberspace, one of the 4 members of Empirical Training, and I'm joined by 2 other members from Empirical Training. We've got Vaughan, our AI automation specialist and SOC lead.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen.
And we've also got Robbie, our SOC lead, former security consultant, and all-around master of accents.
Oh, what's happening?
For those who haven't listened to us before, that was his real accent. You might get some of the simulated ones later on if we can find a relevant time to bring him in, or he catches us completely blindsided by them. But today's topics, so we're going to, in this weekly podcast, we look at some of the key stories from the threat landscape that have occurred last week. Been quite a juicy one. Talking to the boys earlier about how sometimes I just think it's been a bit of a slow week and I have to try and find some things for us to talk about, or even dip back into historic cases or new information that's been come out of historic cases. But this week's been pretty busy. I've found some interesting stories we're going to dive into. First of all, we're going to look at the GitHub supply chain attack, where secrets have been exposed from the public repository that is GitHub. We're also going to look at server-side request forgery. I believe Vaughan's going to take us through a nice definition of what that attack is before we look at why we're talking about this. There's been a huge campaign going in the last couple of weeks that has resulted in some pretty interesting compromises, namely onto GPT, the AI LLM model, which then has got everyone's attention when you throw AI and cybersecurity into one headline. So that's the store for today. This is the team. Myself, product strategist, security strategist, and a host of Empirical Training, and going to try and really dig into the brains of the experts as I introduce them these different stories from the last week. So, GitHub, Robbie, what's your kind of involvement been in GitHub to level set for people who maybe haven't encountered this platform before? Although I think most people probably would have.
What a quick little description of what GitHub is.
Yeah, as low or as high as you want to go with that.
I would say it's just the home for projects in the space, isn't it? So anyone that's built a cool project, they would post the code there, and then other people can use that code and either build out their own application or iterate on top of it.
Well, what kind of stuff do you kind of see on GitHub? What are you using it for?
Yeah, one of the things I'm mainly using it for at the moment is more of a community-based resource. Having a SOC analyst team and an engineering team recently, I'm more heavily involved in the SOC analyst element. So a lot of my time spent on GitHub at the moment is trying to retrieve different rules and different training packages for maybe KQL or Azure or different attack queries for Sentinel. That's pretty much been my foundation using GitHub. However, I'm now starting to move over into the engineering element as well, and having my guys do push and pull requests and having them teach me a little bit as well, and how they store their projects in there along with running pipelines for deployments.
Nice. Yeah, and that's probably the main thing I use it for, right? Is there's open source projects. You can grab security rules from there. People post anything up there. It's just open source repository. But it's probably worth also calling out that it's also used by huge businesses. You can have your own private instance up on there, and you can host your source code. Your devs commit different updates to their different iterations of the code, then get kind of pushed to productions. This is really what's it called? Continuous innovation, continuous development pipeline, I believe is the industry term for it now. It reminds me of Little Britain, guys. Write the theme tune, sing the theme tune. You can write the code, deploy the code.
The action going on.
That's always how I see CI/CD. I hear that, write the theme tune, sing the theme tune guy in my head. For those of you too young to know what Little Britain is, don't Google it. You'll be scarred. It was a different time.
Yeah.
But the reason GitHub is in the news is there's been a supply chain attack, and I love supply chain attacks because basically, for those we need to know that more supply chain attacks is when you kind of compromise one thing in order to use legitimate delivery mechanisms to compromise many things. Think of it kind of metaphorically as like poisoning the watering hole. You're then going to pass on poison to all of the animals who come and drink on the watering hole. And that is a type of supply chain attack called watering hole attack, but also I think it's a good way of understanding how that kind of compromise passes out. But this one was actually a compromise occurred on March the 14th. So, 5-6 days ago is the time of kind of pushing out this podcast. And it managed to dump a load of secrets from any repository using a certain action. So the action is the TJ actions. Shout out to this TJ in the chat earlier. I wonder if he's got any link to this. As well as Wiz also found some other actions that it was also existed in, but it looks to be that they compromised one of the tokens. Unsure exactly how they did it, but it was a GitHub personal access token belonging to a bot account that allowed them to modify multiple versions of the TJ action / change files action 13 workflow. And what this did was when it was then used as a legitimate update for everybody, who then they started using GitHub as they normally would, it actually would release secrets contained within the code in the logs. So this is kind of interesting one. It pushed out to the logs rather than exfiltrating it to any certain kind of hacker controlled infrastructure. Yeah, just leaving it out publicly for anybody to go and see. You might even, if you haven't tidied it up yet, be able to find some in company logs, organizational logs right now if you were to go and look for it. So yeah, kind of any thoughts on this attack, boys? Any thoughts specifically on that last angle of pushing it the data out publicly rather than kind of taking it directly to the attacker owned infrastructure, which we presume could have been possible?
No, nothing from me.
No.
I was just going to ask, was this coming from the individual GitHub instances that were owned by companies?
I think it was anybody who uses that actions, the TJ action piece. Or as Wiz also acknowledged, there are a few other actions that you could also do. The review dog / action setup GitHub action. So anyone who's using that in GitHub, which is a lot of companies, actually it affects 23,000 repositories. So a bit of everybody, really.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, for me, I just thought that was quite interesting that you're pushing out to the logs. The article that I read it for, it said, strangely, malicious code did not exfiltrate the memory output to a remote server, instead only making it visible in publicly accessed repositories, which they thought was strange. And I thought, well, that's smart, right? Because who's to know who did it then? You don't really want it to point back to something you own. You can just go and grab it, and there's a huge level of plausible deniability there. Yeah, maybe you don't even do the attack, collect the information yourself, but you tell you're in partnership with another threat actor or threat group where you're going to say, hey, I'm going to push this out there, and there's going to be loads of secrets for you to go and collect. I'm telling you where to go find them, pay me a bit of money, and off you kind of go. And you can also have multiple people then bid on that, right? It's a scalable type of contract. So that is conjecture for me. I am speculating as to what may have happened, but I did think it was a pretty interesting one on part of this as well. But maybe going back to basics then, the secrets. So we got AWS access keys, GitHub personal access tokens, and private RSA2 keys. What are the kind of consequences for businesses or individuals if this stuff is exposed?
Yeah, I mean, unauthorized access into their environments with the permissions that those access tokens have, whether that's linked up to automations. There's probably API keys in there that allows them to access said resources that have said permissions on them. I'm not sure what lead to compromise happened from these, if any, but yeah, there's, depending on the permissions of the exposed keys, could be access to the kingdom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good question. That don't know what actually has happened, and I didn't see any evidence of the exact fallout. And that's not to say that there isn't fallout from this. It's probably people are working on containing it right now and might disclose in a few days or weeks, or don't know they're actively involved in this right now. They might be catching up. So this is one of those things to talk to most organizations use GitHub. So this is worth bringing up and making sure they can go and check and kind of apply the mitigations, which start with rotating any secrets that were exposed during the attacker timeframe. So it was March 14th and 15th where this stuff was available before it was patched. You can review the workflows of the unexpected outfight in the change file section, so you can actually see what was leaked, and then what checks you might need to go monitor, and ultimately then use that to investigate your machines, look through your logs and such, and see, okay, did anyone have any unusual access or make any unusual changes on those areas where you can use the secrets to log in.
Yeah, do you think this loses trust in these types of organizations that allow other businesses to utilize the platform for anything that they want to do on that site, right? They might just want to internalize all of this moving forward.
Yeah.
Well, what do you think
not leverage GitHub?
What do you think the reputational damage could be for GitHub or the host at GitHub? Is there really any other project-based solutions out there that do the same thing that GitHub does? I can't say I'm aware of them.
Yeah. Well, it's not. You think probably isn't too crazy to recreate what GitHub does, but they're most popular for a reason, that they are very simple to use, and what it needs to do, it does really well, and it becomes a common resource that everyone takes advantage of. I think, Rob, you asked some interesting questions there, kind of like, does GitHub get punished for this? Because you could argue that, hey, how on earth were we to prevent this? Because somebody managed to compromise something on your side that then pushed an update to a certain action that we use with you that then exposed us. Does that then pose a different kind of angle for if a dev just wrote some dodgy code that also wrote secrets to logs? Is that more condemnable because an attacker got in and did it, rather than somebody just wrote a dodgy bit of code or made a little mistake? Because it's the same outcome, really, but I guess you could kind of point fingers in different ways that maybe you should be on this. Like, yes, we accept you're going to make a mistake and write some dodgy code, but we not accept that you're going to have security practices that allow your devs to be compromised, because what else could they potentially have written into that code? So, but those, again, we've probably answered all of our questions with questions, but I would just say, to kind of be a bit more direct, no, I think this is a huge company, a huge platform that everyone thinks is super beneficial. Stuff like this happens no matter who you are. Probably the bigger you are, the more tension is on you, the more bigger target you are, particularly for supply chain compromises. So I think it's the very nature of being the best and being the biggest, you're going to have more of these types of issues. And so as long as you react quickly, which, to be honest, 2 days of it being exposed is fairly short, considered the sometimes the weeks and even months you might have to wait for a vendor to acknowledge vulnerability, actually produce a patch. So my happy to hear if you guys think otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, there's a certain level of risk.
It's good when we disagree, boys.
Yeah, no, either way, there's a certain level of risk that people just have to accept when it comes to using applications, whether they're publicly facing or they're sitting internally in a business.
Mm-hmm.
There's going to be vulnerabilities. There's going to be attackers that are going to exploit those vulnerabilities.
Yeah, so it's about knowing where your attack surface is, where your risk might be, and understanding that something like GitHub, which you could be fair to saying, like a security immature organization would say, hey, that's all been taken care of. That's not a risk. I just something that I use and it's owned by somebody else, so I don't have to worry about it. Now, anything you use introduces risk to your organization, whether that's in how you use it, or whether that's just in the expanded attack surface that they could be targeted. It could be a way in to your stuff. Vaughan, the spotlight is on you now. We're going to dive into the next two stories. The rest of this pod is going to be focused on SSRF, server-side request forgery attacks, because they've exploded in the recent weeks. And so if you could just level set for us and tell us, what is an SSRF, server-side request forgery attack?
Yeah, for sure. Get ready for your SSRF 101. So server-side request forgery is where an application allows you to input a URL that the server side will query for you. Where the request forgery part comes in is where there's a vulnerability in the request portion that doesn't validate or sanitize the URL that is being input. So you can inject a URL that you want the server to request on behalf of yourself. What this allows for is for the request to be made from the server and not your personal browser, So that server may have access into certain resources or permissions to certain areas of the internal network or via APIs that you typically wouldn't have access to as a typical user. So that can be used to execute code, retrieve different files, whatever you want in terms of getting this machine to do something that it's not intended to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that the last bits you kind of adjusted on, because the mechanism isn't all that complicated of how it does it, but getting a machine, an internal machine to start making call outs and doing stuff for you. Basically, it's like Robbie, you love your man in the middle attacks, but it's basically you've taken one of their infrastructures and put that in the middle of you to then launch any subsequent attempts you might want to do, whether it's reconnaissance, and just, okay, now you've got one internet exposed asset and I can use that to ping all the other stuff on your internal network to see what you've got hidden behind there, or whether there's data.
It's almost like a B-Tech CNC. Like you're doing it through the application layer rather than actually having a bug or remote access or web shell on an actual device.
Yeah,
so
and it also goes past trying to request like internal services, but since that request originates from that trusted server, you could do things like bypass a firewall, which is pretty crazy.
Mm-hmm.
That's for me the biggest things, right? Because we talk a lot about risk prioritization and threat modeling. You know that your internet connected assets are the most exposed, so you take extra precautions with that, and whether that's security configurations, patching, hardening that side, or whether it's putting a web application firewall in front of it, that's something that's really targeted bodyguard, that is going to be super beefed up and protected. But if all of a sudden you get the server that's sitting behind it, to get the request to them, and they start making the dodgy requests onwards, it's not really a kind of pathway that you would have anticipated in the same way as to be so threatening. So that's spot on. I think that's probably the biggest thing, is you bypass the security controls that are already.
Yeah, we need to get some red teamers on to be giving their hot take on this.
It's almost like the mafia having a mole, for example. Like they've got someone on the inside that can kind of go off and do whatever they wish.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. You've made the server your insider threat, so you haven't had to blackmail them and say you're going to release dirt on their family or whatever. You just, as we all know, machines, they're incredibly stupid. They just do what they're told, and you've managed to convince this to be your inside guy, which I think makes it pretty interesting. So, but yeah, this is probably fair to say not something you see every day. Like if I'm thinking back to 5 or so years ago when I was back still in SOC, I don't remember seeing a whole lot of server-side request forgery attempts, and even less successful ones, right? What is that kind of line with you guys now?
Yeah, absolutely. Server-side request forgery, I haven't seen as super common. Like your typical injection-based attacks, like Apache Struts, SQL, we saw a lot. But yeah, server-side request forgery is a little on the quiet side previously.
It's making a comeback then.
Yeah,
I'm not even making a comeback.
It's come back.
Yeah, it's just here. It's just making an appearance.
Yeah, it's come back in force, and this is the kind of interesting thing about working in cybersecurity, isn't it? That the flavor of today is not necessarily the flavor of tomorrow, and sometimes we get so hyperfixated on what's the latest new attack, even what's the shiny CVE 2025 blah 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 that you need to worry about. But sometimes it's just a pivot in attackers' techniques or their favored exploits, favored techniques, thinking, hey, do you know what? I haven't really used SSRF before, and probably not many people have. Maybe I'm going to have a lot of success here. I could almost see a threat actor group being a little bit disheartened by having some good security that they've come up against, maybe some good WAFs, and they think, do you know what, screw this, I can't get past WAFs, so how about I just use an exploit that is built to kind of get around them, which is one interpretation of why they've done this. But to bring us on to the news, right, rather than just the education, there's been seen 400 plus IP addresses actively exploiting multiple SSRF vulnerabilities in the wild. And this goes back towards the beginning of March. Probably the real surge detected on March 9th. I think Grey Noise kind of led some of this, their security research team, and some others also. But I'm looking at the CVE list, and I'm not going to bore people by reading them all out now, but we've got stuff that goes as far back as 2020 in Zimbra. We've got some GitLab ones. We've got .NET Nuke, which is a great name. There's a 2017 CVE. And these are all been seen being successful, right? It's not just attempts. These are old vulnerabilities that people aren't aware they're running or thought, hey, it's not a big deal. SSRF isn't that big a deal. I'm not going to patch this as a matter of priority. But we're seeing them be successful. So, yeah, we're back to the age-old thing of, why are these things not patched? Why are we seeing, how many is that? 5 + 3, 8-year-old vulnerability being exploited in the wild on web applications. So it's web-facing.
Do you think it's an interesting one for you, Josh? Do you think with like patching and awareness cadence, you can almost think of, I think of it kind of like the snake game, where it's kind of going round and there's the tail. So people are obviously really quick to patch the stuff that's in the news, but there's the stuff towards the end that's kind of fading away, and that's almost always adjusting as people kind of pick up new things and old things get forgotten about. So yeah, it seems like threat actors are trying to move more towards the tail end of that snake to see which things might be under the radar of people's priority lists to be patching.
Yeah, it's a great point. I think hackers read the news just like we do, and if they think there's super loads of focus, like endpoint centric threats were probably the big one maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and I'm not saying they've gone away, but I think that they're less elevated as being the one everyone talks about, and it's probably because when everyone cares about endpoint centric threats, they invest in endpoint controls, and endpoint security vendors do really well, and so they just pivot, come from another angle, and it's almost. Yeah, I don't want to blame anybody, but like, you can maybe the opposite is here. That maybe you can say, hey, who's to blame a company for not patching a 2017-year-old vulnerability when it's been there for 5, 6, 7, 8 years and it hasn't been exploited? They might be thinking, oh yeah, well, it doesn't matter. We haven't got to that one. Like, that's super low on my priority list. Look at all these shiny new ones that have popped out, and it kind of just points to the futility of patch management.
Sure, the onus is on the company, right? If a patch is there. Like, obviously, I've seen organizations with a lot of vulnerabilities. There is a priority that needs to be applied to them, but of course, you should be trying to get through everything that's there.
Mm-hmm. So I think we'll kind of move on to the big juicy one in a moment, the Chat GPT piece. So stick around for that, guys. Everyone loves it when that's getting exploited. But yeah, to your point there, it's the prioritization is huge when it comes to patch management, because we know you can't patch everything. It's impossible. And the main focus is like trying to find that sweet spot in the Venn diagram of, what vulnerabilities do you have is one circle. Another circle would be what ones are accessible to an attacker. And then also another Venn diagram is what ones are actively being exploited in the wild. And then where those three things cross over, those are the ones you prioritize for patching. But even with that system, knowing which ones have been exploited in the wild is a reactive task. It's not proactive. So you're always going to have this element of playing catch up, particularly if there's what feels like a seismic shift. That feels like a bit too big to say, but a seismic shift in attacker activity focusing on these SSRFs.
Or just quickly, do you go for the tinfoil hat move where you patch the things that aren't being exploited with the idea that attackers are going to loop back around to start exploiting those?
Well, yeah, you want to patch everything, but it's a time and resource constraint, isn't it? I don't think how many businesses just have a vulnerability management team. Normally it's, our IT guys make sure that you do a little bit of patching here and there, or you outsource it to somebody, and then they're not solely focusing on that. It is always a bit of a side quest, isn't it? It's
side
never
quest.
It is, isn't it? It's always, make sure that you do patching, not 100% focusing on it.
Yeah. My corporate company, we sell a vulnerability management service, so there's obviously a need for people out there to have the support in that area. And some technical teams just aren't familiar with the patch manager strategies and what you can use, and even, as you say, and how do you prioritize them.
The never-ending patching side quests. I like that, Rob. That's a good title for something. I don't know, a weird book or a Dungeons and Dragons campaign. But yeah, I think it's a grind, really, isn't it? Like, to use more gamer terms, right? You're constantly grinding vulnerabilities and hardening mitigations, and new content being released every day for you to play, and it's impossible to complete it. And even if you have, I would love to see if any company could show me that for one day we had zero vulnerabilities. And I don't mean startups. I mean like a proper big company. But yeah, I guess
it's whack-a-mole, isn't it? I've got that video of me in Brighton literally playing the whack-a-mole game. So maybe we just keep recreating more real memes of me, and it's just talking about Patch Tuesdays coming round every other Tuesday.
And that begs me, I'm definitely going to ask you one day if patching's a side quest. We don't have time for it now, but what is the main quest?
Cyberspace.
Let's look at an example that made this really interesting. So this is kind of a little bit more fresher there towards the end of this week. That ChatGPT was found to be vulnerable, or rather, to be clearer, because that's what the article says, the infrastructure running ChatGPT was found to be vulnerable to one of these SSRF exploits. This was it's a 2024 CVE, so maybe we'll be slightly more forgiving. I don't want to paint them with the same brush as the 2017 one, but it allows, as Vaughan said, kind of reiterating that, attackers to inject malicious URLs into input parameters, forcing the application to make unintended requests. And so you could actually do this to people's ChatGPT instances, and interestingly is being used to target mainly financial institutions and government institutions in the US. So using their internet exposed ChatGPT instance then bounce onto the machines that might be you're allowed to access that or connect into it, which could well be internal machine systems. But yeah, it's not given much detail on exactly how they kind of compromise it. So Vaughan, you got any speculation of kind of like how SSRF works, how this could be used?
Yeah, this is kind of I don't know if it's a question or a hypothesis, but yeah, I'm assuming it's not the OpenAI instance of ChatGPT that's been compromised. It must be an organization hosted version that they run in libraries in order to facilitate this, that then has the vulnerability for the SSRF. Yeah, well, I guess what do you do in that situation? You've probably built the library from a GitHub repo or documentation from OpenAI. So you're kind of potentially following their best practices, I assume, but do you need to check the code?
Check the code, yeah. You can't trust nobody's code these days. And I think we're seeing these kind of third party, anyone you work with is a third party, introduces risks. Say that before and I'll say that again, and people are becoming a lot more wiser to that. But where do you draw the line, right? Because I think there's a lot of focus on third party IT providers who have big access into your network, but that it's harder to convince people to prioritize. Hey, we need to be super secure with our ChatGPT thing, or we need to kind of make sure we're querying what they're running it on, because we can't just willy-nilly deploy it. But the exploit itself, to give more information, is in the pictureproxy.php component in one of the commits. So it's it's infrastructure running OpenAI ChatGPT, and it makes it's remote code execution is possible from here. So remote code execution is pretty big. You can do a lot of things. You could create a web shell. You could jump on the button. You can worm into some other systems. So yeah, fairly impactful. But interestingly, the CVS score 6.5. This is ranked the medium vulnerability. Yeah.
Wow.
It kind of goes to that whole point of the prioritization, right? And that we know that those CVS scores themselves aren't great, but aren't great. Sorry, that's unfair. Aren't a complete reflection of the impact. They tried their best to work out what's the kind of how bad it could be. So yeah, well, it's a tricky one. Can you imagine? You could imagine being a security analyst and saying, "Yeah, we'll leave that one. It's a medium. It's not too big a deal. Let's focus on these other ones." And then you wake up the next day, and lo and behold, ChatGPT's got compromised.
Yeah, I bet the pen testers are rubbing their hands together right now. It's just more opportunities for them for a little bit of work, but I think it just shines a light on the situation and the gravity of using these types of tools and the importance of ensuring that they're hardened correctly and they're safe.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you think the hype has kind of set people up for disaster on this one as well? Like everyone's like, yeah, let's get ChatGPT implemented. It has all these features. Let's plug it into all of our systems. And maybe they haven't gone through the proper preliminary checks and the code reviews to make sure that it does what it's supposed to and is secure in the ways that it's supposed to. And they've probably pushed it through off hype and FOMO and these things may not have got caught when they should have.
Mm.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's kind of where capitalism becomes the enemy of security, because if everyone else is rushing to implement AI and it becomes all their marketing, you want to do it as well, get those efficiencies, be more competitive, maybe at the expense of doing it securely. So yeah, I could probably say, hey, are you going to really read through the code of everything you deploy? Even if you did, would you notice the bad stuff? But I think maybe there's some more basic recommendations that we could be made here, like really segmenting access to things. So if they do manage to compromise the ChatGPT instance, what has that got access to? Let's make sure it's as limited as possible. And yeah, and just also make sure you monitor those logs, right? If you're seeing the ChatGPT server, whoever's hosting this private version of it, starts making call outs itself to machines, it's a bit of an abnormal behavior that you'd think, right? You'd think it'd probably be more responding to requests from things. So it's also a good detection that to make sure that the AI doesn't run wild and make sure it doesn't start doing its own things. Because what if there's even scarier scenario if it start making its own calls and nobody even told it to, exploit or not?
Yeah, and it's running itself. I think
and it was instructed from another AI.
Yeah. AI SSRF in AIs. Now that's a world. That's the Terminator. Terminator 4. Robots fighting each other. I don't know which one's which. I can't remember.
I think the really important point you said there, Josh, is monitoring the logs around there, having some detections built that allows you to monitor this stuff, or even just periodically checking them. I've gone completely blank, but yeah, just being able to have the detections there that can highlight when this sort of stuff is going awry.
Mm-hmm. And I think you've probably gone blank because we're running over. This has taken a little bit longer than normal, but I think it's because we had some good conversations. We'll have to make some choice decisions on what makes the edit and what doesn't. But I think we've covered off the key points there, so we'll wrap it up. So, Vaughan, Robbie, I'll give you a chance to kind of end with any thoughts or any messages that you want. But while I do that, I should roll out a little bit of the carpet for the listeners who are listening to Cyberspace by Empirical Training. This podcast happens every week. If you're listening, you probably already know that, and if you don't, make sure you hit subscribe so you can catch us on the regular. You can actually be part of this podcast as well. We record it every Tuesday, 8 p.m. GMT. You can find us on YouTube to see that. And if you want to have access to us every hour of every day, not quite, but if you want to be in the same place where we are having conversations about cybersecurity on a daily basis with a really engaged community, you can head over to school.com, school with a K, /cybersec, and you'll find our free community with plenty of like-minded cybersecurity individuals and resources for you to stick your teeth into also. So, Robbie, Vaughan, thank you very much. Is there anything you want to add before we bring us out finally?
I would say pen test all your applications, and it would be cool if we had a little plug here for some type of penetration testing company. So,
you want to get an ad? Yeah, you can give you ideas as well. Maybe start up your own SSRF pen test module, and you can just do what they did. Try a whole bunch of those and kind of simulate these little campaigns. I think those adversary simulation ones I always find the most interesting, because I think you get a real taste of it and probably more of a good test of your defenses, or rather of the real life scenarios with your security teams. But yeah, that's good. Hit us up. You know where to find us. Find us on School if you do want us to get to just put shout outs to you in the podcast, or if you just want to have somebody come on and talk about it. We'd love to get more insights from more experts for our community. But yeah, thank you very much, Robbie and Vaughan. My name's Josh, and we have been Empirical Training. This was Cyberspace.
Cyberspace.